Welcome everyone to today's webinar on introducing the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab case studies. My name is Michael Skaggs. I'm Director of Programs for the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab, and we're very happy to have you here with us today. First, like most of our events, this is being recorded, and so if you miss a point or need to come back to something, that's not a problem at all. You can always watch the recording later. You'll get a link to that here in the next couple of days, so no worries if you happen to miss something. When you do get that link to the recording, there's also a link to a feedback form at the very end of that email, and so if you could just spend 2 or 3 minutes filling that out, that would be wonderful. That helps us to be more responsive to what you are interested in and need in the future. So let me introduce our guests. Elizabeth Aeschlimann is the Interim Director of Community Building at Tufts University. Jawad Bayat is Manager of Pastoral Care and CPE at Penn Medicine Princeton House Behavioral Health. Libby Gadi works for Partners of Health as part of their COVID response team. And Munir Sheikh is Vice President of Operations and Academic Affairs at Bayan Islamic Graduate School. So we're really excited to formally launch these case studies today. Although if you get our newsletter and follow us on social media, you'll know that they've been out for a little while, but we wanted to have an event to mark the occasion. They are part of our project Educating Effective Chaplains, which is supported by the Henry Luce Foundation and in partnership with Boston University School of Theology. Next year, a textbook will be coming out as a result of this project as well. It will sort of be a companion piece with the case studies. They stand alone completely, but if you like the case studies, you'll definitely want to check out the textbook when it comes out next year. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Liz, let's turn to you first on your work at Vassar and the origins of the case study project there. How did it come about?
Sure. Well, so this case study is, real life, my experience, and I was really thrilled to have the chance to turn it into a case study with the other folks on the team. So this case study was focused on developing organizational competency, and that is just such a crucial skill for chaplains in any field, analyzing sort of who in the institution really has influence, who is supportive of chaplaincy, who might not be as supportive. And then the part that we were really excited about with this Vassar experience was that it kind of focuses on the organizational competency of analyzing your environment in terms of who you're trying to serve, who your users are, to use design thinking speak. So at Vassar, we, the chaplaincy has been around for a long time. It's kind of a venerated institution. And by the time I started working at Vassar, it was really clear that the way the chaplaincy was perceived was sort of as a peripheral religious institution, Christian, white, whereas at that point the students were 45% atheist and agnostic, very much not white in the same way that they had been in 1938, and that there were just lots of subgroups among the students that we were trying to serve that we weren't really meeting their needs. So this case study really tells the story of and tries to give some specific concrete tools for how one could use design thinking, and in particular kind of a discovery process, to really analyze who are your people, what are their experiences like, what do they need, and how might you shift what your chaplaincy looks like and what your mission is, and how you do what you do away potentially from this is just how we've always done things, to what's really going to serve the people that we have in front of us.
That's wonderful, thank you. And as you mentioned, the changing demographics from 1938, there are a lot of changes to account for in that couple of decades between then and now. Thank you, Liz. Jawad, how about you? This was a really interesting case study, Healing or Hallucination. It's sort of the first one that you see if you do it sequentially going through the case studies. How did this come about?
Great. Well, yeah, thanks for having me. It's been, it came about as we were in the beginning stages. We had a few case studies presented before us, so already constructed. And, the choice of it was with my other colleagues, but I'll speak from my own kind of, uh, perspective that I was, in looking at these case studies, I was really attracted to this one because of how evocative it was. And so both with its title, its name, and then also with what it entailed. Of course, as we worked on this and we expanded it, it developed more from what the original case itself was. But in terms of interpersonal competency, so much of, as a chaplain, spiritual care provider, wherever we are in whatever setting there is, um, that's the process. And it's really hard to engage in a very full way interpersonally, and kind of break down dynamics around that when things are hunky-dory and things are just like fine and it's like coasting. There's not really much to really talk about, as far as I have discerned it as an educator. So things that produce more interest and intrigue emotionally tend to bring that up. So here you have different authority figures in that space, and then you have your care recipient that's there as well, and then you have yourself. So you have sort of a triangle, and so it presents this very, I think, emotionally engaging space. And quite frankly, as someone who plays video games, I was imagining going through this experience as like a simulation. And so here I am as a chaplain, I'm the avatar. So whatever space you're in, whoever you are, that's the space from which you'll be providing feedback from. So like I said, at least from my hope is that whoever engages in this interpersonal case study, it's going to produce different outcomes in terms of reactions, like at the different points that you get to in the case study. And so, with the final questions that are there, it's meant to help bring it together in a reflective way. So I hope that kind of gives you a sense of how it was chosen, and then also the process for which, the interpersonal case study kind of developed.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jawad. Libby, how about your case study?
Sure, thanks. And Jawad, I love that image of the avatar. I think our team also really had that in mind, thinking about street chaplaincy just as such a embodied kind of chaplaincy. So our case features chaplaincy in one of its most de-institutionalized forms as ministry with folks living on the street or in shelters. And I think it really underscores a core truth at the heart of all chaplaincy work, which is the belief in the fundamental dignity and sacredness of all life. I think that's a line in one of our first slides. So this affirmation is essential to the work of chaplaincy in all sectors, but here it really can't be taken for granted, working as a chaplain with folks on the street. So there are so many forces that are disparaging the sacredness of life, of the lives of folks who are unhoused. And so in that context, deep and explicit countering of that dishonoring is critical. So that's a little bit of what we wanted to explore. Even more care is merited and even more intention. Of course, we hope to be intentional in all of our chaplaincy spaces. But because there's so little protection available for folks who are unhoused, greater integrity is required. So we thought this was a really important context from which to explore the skill of ritual creation and the competency of meaning making. So those were our the focuses for our case study. And these are just critical for chaplains to internalize because they're such a huge part of the practical work of chaplaincy. So just to say a little bit about that, ritual helps to express something that's already true, and to help make it it's both descriptive and also transformative. So it acknowledges something as true and also moves it towards deeper truth. So, in our case study, we explored make the meaning making and ritual creation for an unhoused individual named Bill, and thinking through how his life really matters and creating a ritual to express the truth of his dignity, and how that's really the role of the chaplain in his passing. And so it's important for him to be honored, and it's especially important for those in the unhoused community to witness and participate in that honoring, as it affirms something about Bill's community mates as well as his own life. So that was part of a little bit of the kind of thinking that went into why we chose that specific context and scenario.
You know, what occurs to me when you mentioned at the outset, the devaluing the value of the lives of these folks, that's one problem. Another problem, I think, is just not even considering this. It's an unseen problem for so many people, right? Depending on where you live, your your patterns of movement, you may never even see these people, and so I don't know if it's a worse problem or not. But it's not that you devalue; it's just that there's no, there's no thought whatsoever. And so making meaning of that life, not only for Bill, but for everyone else, is such a critical task. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Munir, how about you?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I recall back in some of the conversations we had in a larger group setting in terms of what these case studies might end up looking like. And I remember that some of the things we thought that we needed to include was to make sure that we have, a diverse representation of different religious traditions. We would also make sure that we would touch upon different contexts, whether they're institutional or the context that Libby was speaking to, and whether they would involve interpersonal dynamics or something related to just institutional policy. So I think across the board, we were able to touch upon these various things. In the case study that I ended up working on, which, I have to give a lot of credit to Heidi Kugler, who's not with us, but given her background in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, we were really able to craft this case study, which takes a look at sort of the challenges that occur when you have different religious populations within a institutional context like prison, and when there's a particular time of year where there might be conflicts or competing needs across those religious traditions, how does one as a chaplain engage the situation and make some determinations that would be in service to those communities, but also true to one's own convictions as a chaplain in terms of looking out for the interests of multiple groups of people and not just one's own. So that was kind of really the heart of this particular case study. And it touches upon not only one's own convictions and how one navigates that. We provide opportunities through the case study for individuals to consider where the place of consultation with mentors comes in when you're faced with a difficult challenge. We're also looking at, basically dealing with limited resources and how those can get distributed in a very confined and regulated space like a prison. In this particular case, the scenario was that a particular Friday in the year was the Friday of Good Friday, and also the day of congregational prayer for Muslims, and also a Seder, a Passover time. So the case study asks the individuals going through it to contemplate the different interests that are at stake and the biases that we as chaplains might have, given our own convictions, our own commitments, and how we account for that in relation to the needs of others. So I think it was a very useful case study in terms of looking at not only sort of theological issues, but also just practical issues of managing resources.
Munir, you've started to touch on my follow-up question, and I think that what you've said is so true for all areas of spiritual care. And very intentionally, we selected these case studies not because we wanted to present a case study on corrections, one on higher ed, one on healthcare, one on street chaplaincy. Those happen to be sort of the settings in which a particular skill or competency is being shown, right? So they weren't incidental. That's too casual a word. But the important thing is, what can a chaplain take away from this? And so the question I want to come around to is, given that all of you are working within very particular settings, what is it that chaplains should take away in such a way that any chaplain should know that all four of these are important for them not just, well, my work is sort of most like higher ed, or I, I have some experience in healthcare, but why should a chaplain go through every one of these case studies? And I'll start with you, Liz, with what the sort of the key takeaway here, the point of reflection.
Yeah, well, the setting for our case study was higher ed, but the competency is organizational competency. And every chaplain works within some sort of system, whether that's a giant institution like a hospital or the Federal Bureau of Prisons, or something much more kind of small, like the kind of ministry that Libby's talking about, street chaplaincy. There are always kind of interpersonal dynamics and kind of systems level things going on that make a huge difference to the success of our work as chaplains. I remember I heard about a chaplain who also worked in higher ed, saying that they had a very friendly dog who liked to wander around the campus. And they kind of commented wryly, that's how my administration seems to view me. As the chaplain, I'm like the friendly dog who wanders around. So with that kind of being pushed to the periphery, that way that chaplains are sometimes seen is kind of ages away from a situation like we ended up having at Vassar over the past few years, where we had really strong support from the college president to the deans to everyone, lots of allies. So all that to say, like, all chaplains are working within some sort of systemic structure. All chaplains are trying to serve people, and knowing how to analyze on both of those levels, and how to make change and find the areas where you can really have some influence, I think really goes across any setting.
I think this is something that is really coming to be more and more acknowledged as a crucial component of chaplaincy anywhere, because in many cases, this is just simply not part of the curriculum, and that's understandable, right? I mean, if you're in an MDiv program or whatever, navigating organizational politics is probably not going to be a course that you're going to take. But really anybody can use that, if you're a chaplain or not. And in so many cases, chaplains are really, really good at helping other people. In fact, they're so good at it, they don't want to talk about themselves. What we're accomplishing with this case study and with the idea of organizational navigation is not sort of being prideful about your work, but advocating for yourself effectively so that you can do that work in a more effective way into the future. That the image of the friendly dog is really interesting, because I think everyone can understand it, and in some way you might think, oh, I want to be the friendly dog, but at the end of the day, it's just a friendly dog, and it needs to be more than that if you're going to be a chaplain. So thank you. Jawad, what should any chaplain take away from your case study?
That we are all inextricably connected, right? So that we're all interpersonally connected, regardless of the setting and the institution that we're in. That's broadly. Specifically, within the case study, we are one of the points that we highlight strongly in there is about the spiritual assessment, and that's not something that's reserved to what happens within the healthcare setting. It's not. It's actually like very much like when someone does 1 unit of clinical pastoral education. My hope is that not everyone who does 1 unit of CPE continues and becomes a healthcare chaplain by doing 4 units and stuff like that. That's not the main idea. The main idea is to get the learnings that what 1 unit can do, so you can then apply it to whichever setting you go into, be it prison ministry, street, college, so on and so forth. Having said that, with the spiritual assessment, what it does in this case study is that we present one version of a spiritual assessment as like a strong taster for what it looks like to be able to discern what the presenting spiritual concern or need is of the person before you. In this case, it's Angie who's within a hospital setting. But if you generalize that, which we try to do as you move forward in the case study, it's about trying to understand that aspect. How do I discern what the presenting need is before me, the presenting spiritual concerns, presenting spiritual need? And as a result of that, what do I then do? What's my intervention, right? How do I respond to that? That's something that we're thinking about anytime, because whenever we do spiritual care, we're connected to someone that we're providing spiritual care in relationship to. So then you have the presenting need, and then you have the intervention that corresponds to this, right? That's what the case study is trying to walk us through. And then what's the outcome that's seen as a result of that? So you have that, and then the plan of care, perhaps, like, well, what am I going to do with this? What's my follow-up plan of care with this patient, Angie, for instance? But I used to be a college chaplain. That was something I was thinking about anyways. What am I going to do with my student who just left me? How do I? What's my follow-up plan? How am I going to interact with them to the future? This provides an actual avenue of how you think about your relationships, right? With spiritual assessment. Now, within that frame in the interpersonal, case study is that, so what gets in your way of doing this? And what actually helps you? And so that's also what we're looking at here too. So we're looking at, we all have assumptions. That is actually, to be human is to assume. Otherwise, it's hard to even do what we're doing right now. I have to assume that you're listening to me in order for me to even faithfully speak with you. So we have assumptions and we have these things, and part of it's trying to understand that better, to see when it's getting in our way and when it's also serving us. And so the case study is trying to do that as well, so that when we're interpersonally relating to folks and trying to provide spiritual care, we're using it rather than it using us. So that's what this is trying to essentially bring together. And there are particularities regarding charting that's in this case study, that goes into the medical chart. And I'm connecting with what Liz was also saying. I think you were kind of building on that, Michael, about like with charting, you are stating what happened. You're making the observations of what happened, and that's not gloating or anything like that. You did the work. You need to represent it accurately. Otherwise, it's hard for you to then interpersonally work well with your colleagues and coworkers in these spaces. If you can't name what you did, it's hard for then people to use what you did well. And so I'm sticking with it.
Wonderful. You mentioned spiritual assessment. I think this is such an interesting topic. Anyone who takes a look through the research into healthcare chaplaincy knows that spiritual assessment is something that's been one of the more researched topics in that field. One thing, and this is a plug for the lab, I'm gonna say it openly. The lab has been involved in a number of efforts to provide training to non-chaplains to conduct very basic spiritual assessments, in this case in the healthcare setting, so that those people are more aware of the fact that patients are going to have spiritual needs. And you could generalize that anywhere, college students, whatever. These people, whoever they might be, are in a moment of transition, of tension, of difficulty. And for many people, there's going to be a spiritual aspect of that. Now, they may not want to talk about it. They may say, well, it's so minor, I'm not even thinking about it. But for other people, it's a really big deal. Knowing what to look out for and to recognize that and maybe connect them with the resources of a chaplain is such a service that I think is owed to most of the people that might be, within some sort of institution. So thank you, Jawad. Libby, same question to you.
Sure, thanks. So I'm trying to remember the question because I was trying to really listen.
So if any chaplain, no matter where they work, what are they going to take away from your case study that they can put into use?
Great. Thank you. Thanks for that. Well, I think meaning making helps people face and integrate big experiences in their lives. So not just emotional, but spiritual and physical experiences as well. So creating rituals is not just an essential, but it's also a beautiful skill to bring to that work of meaning making. So I think these embodied rituals help to bring our bodies into the meaning of the experience. So it's not just like, I think this is just such an essential competency. It's not just handing over the meaning of your own religious tradition or background, but it's creating meaning together. In our study, we focused on through creating a ritual that affirms the sacredness and the dignity of a life. But it's just such an important skill in any setting. I think for folks who are working as chaplains explicitly, and for folks who are just taking on some of the role of chaplaincy in their setting. So whether or not that's your explicit job title, I think that it would be a really useful skill to have, to be able to say, okay, there's a big experience that we've had together as a group, or you've had my friend or my sibling, or someone that I'm working with in whatever setting. How can I help to integrate that experience spiritually, emotionally, physically into some deeper meaning, and into a value system? So I think that, our study was very rooted in my experiences as a street chaplain, but certainly could be universalized to anyone who's approaching just the bigness of life, and trying to figure out, how do we integrate this? How do we ritualize this so that as a community we have a sense of who we are, and something that's resonant with the rest of the story of my life or your life or our life as a group together. So I just think it's such a important skill for chaplains everywhere to be able to develop. We really got into the kind of like the nitty gritty of like, how do you develop a ritual that is culturally competent, that helps to generate that sense of meaning and purpose, or values, and also that serves as a container to really hold the depth of the experience of grief or the experience of joy. Our study focused on a ritual for the loss of life, and I think some of the same principles apply to other big experiences in life. Yeah.
All four of you have really different educational backgrounds coming into what you are doing now. And while I know most of our audience today is chaplains who are already out doing the work, some of them are students, and I do want students to be able to take something away from this as well, because it's important to note, these are available to anybody. It's not only for chaplains that are already doing the work. Anybody can be doing this, and it's specifically part of that project on, if we look at the landscape of education for chaplaincy, what are some additional contributions that we might be able to make to say, here are some things to think about as well? All of which is to say, as you reflect on your own education, your own preparation for the work you're doing now, what should students be thinking about? How can they kind of hone these competencies beyond the 4 case studies? What can they be doing now so that they don't have to wait until they're in a job to start figuring these things out, which of course is the wrong time to start figuring them out? And that's for anybody.
Maybe I could just say something here, because it kind of is in line with the last question, or what I was thinking about as others were responding. I think that, in the graduate school, in the various programs that students might be in, there's a very generally positive outlook. Like, we want to become more interreligious. We want to honor different traditions, whether they're, well-known traditions or less well-known traditions. We want to create a space where everyone can feel honored and seen and recognized. I think that happens in the educational space. Now, when you then get a job and you're in a particular institution in some city, the reality may not accord with, the anticipation that one might have in school. So I think the case study that we worked on is related to this in the sense that, you know, there is implicit bias. There is a paternalism that is often present in various spaces because of just the genealogy of the profession. And of course, those things are changing as people of various backgrounds are taking their place within the landscape of chaplaincy, but still there's a lot of imbalance. And so a student or someone new in the position might feel intimidated, might feel disenchanted. So I think that opportunities through the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab and other professional development opportunities are very important and very necessary in order to kind of get that reality check and build a network of like-minded individuals and colleagues and learn from them and sort of get the inside scoop on what the job or the work is really like, whatever the context might be. So I think that that's quite important. In our particular case study, there was a series of video clips from some chaplains, one of whom was an imam, and I really liked what he had to say. Is, you know, he's asked as a chaplain in the prison to assist with the fulfilling of various ritual practices of other faith traditions, and you know, anybody might feel uncomfortable with that initially, right? And chaplains have to develop a capacity to be of service in that regard. And he was reflecting on that, and he came to understand that any chaplain of any background is really there to increase the presence of light in that context, not to create darkness or division. And I think that attitude is something that's important to cultivate. And I think that, you know, existing chaplains or chaplains to be, you know, should look out for those kinds of opportunities where that they can grow and expand their capacity to be of service.
I think when it comes to developing skills around navigating organizations, my sort of snarky answer is organize. Like, find something that you want to change and try to change it, and you will very quickly run into having to figure out who has the power, who has the influence, who can be your allies, yeah, how do you sort of think about navigating within an institution? So I think that can be a great way to sort of learn about what it means to try to make change in an organization. I think another thing that's really important is understanding more about what it's like to be at the top, to have some power, to be kind of in a middle position, and to be on the bottom. Chaplains so often are in the middle. You know, we are reporting to someone else who's in charge, and we often don't get the last say about things, but we're also trying to serve people who may have less access to the institution or to resources or whatever than we do. So that feels like another kind of interesting aspect to explore. Like, what does it mean to really learn from people in those different kinds of roles and positions within an organization, or to experience them for yourself? What is it like to be the president of a student organization and have everyone suddenly coming to you saying, like, you're doing a terrible job, like, we should be doing this thing, let's change that? And what does it mean to really feel disempowered in an institution and feel like you have very little say in what happens? So I think getting a kind of personal understanding of those different positions is also very helpful for developing that muscle as chaplains.
Liz, I want to stay with you for a minute, because in all the scenarios that we're talking about, we've been focusing exclusively on the chaplain's role in those scenarios. In a place like Vassar, an institution of higher learning, you know, I think, at least in my opinion, you're talking about the biggest shift in the way chaplaincy was understood and practiced, with what you were able to accomplish at Vassar. I'm curious on 2 points. A, what does student involvement with spiritual life look like at Vassar? And B, what role did they play in this transition from sort of what had come before to what it is now, which is a much more responsive and active part of campus life?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in our kind of change process, we started by interviewing 30 students in great depth about their lives and where they spent time on campus, what they were excited about and interested in, what was hard for them, what brought them joy. So their input was really the foundation of developing a new mission, essentially around building community and helping students find belonging in difference in a culture that could feel sometimes toxic or fragmented. So that was one level, but really the kind of ideal feels like bringing students themselves into doing that design process, having students who learn how to ask their peers, what is your experience on campus like? What do you need from religious and spiritual life? What are you longing for? And we have had now a number of sort of experiments in that. And this year, I haven't been at Vassar, but my understanding is that our group of student interns was really trained to do that discovery process. And they, during this year of COVID, they really identified what their peers' needs were. And they developed this kind of spring festival, bringing people out to explore different religious communities. And so that kind of bringing students into creating for themselves has been really exciting.
That's really interesting. A few years ago, the lab assisted with a research survey that essentially asked a campus, a liberal arts campus, what do you think of spiritual life? It's much more detailed than that. But we learned an enormous amount of what that looks like. And for students to be sort of co-creators of that experience, I think is so critical, because without that, a lot of students just sort of fall out for a variety of reasons. Sticking on that theme of kind of the other side of the table, I want to ask a little bit about some of the reality, the real situations that run underneath of these case studies, because those of us who are working in this world professionally, we can read these and think, this is really great progress in what it means to be a chaplain. If a chaplain can internalize these lessons, that's going to make them better at what they do. But that doesn't mean that everybody on the other side of the table has the same reaction. And so I want to, maybe we'll start with Libby. If you think about some of the folks that you've worked with in street chaplaincy, what kind of interactions do you have when you first meet somebody? When you say, I'm a chaplain, what is their response? I'm imagining that creating this ritual for Bill is incredibly meaningful, but I can also imagine there being a lot of barriers to even having that ritual be possible. What does that look like in your work?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a great question, and we actually go into this in the case study a little bit about what is your first interactions like with folks in the unhoused community, and we talk a little bit about like the first time meeting someone, greeting someone in the morning, just the different boundaries that are needed and the discernment around boundaries. When you're working with folks who don't get to close the door and kind of collect themselves or don't get to choose whether or not they see you, or they don't get to choose, they can't just close the door and say, I actually don't want a chaplaincy visit right now. So trying to create doors for people that they can close is a big part of it. And that they can open, and making sure that the door, is greased on the hinges for those interactions, to just extend the metaphor a little. And I think a big part of the sensitivity that's needed, I think, especially in street chaplaincy, is just how much spiritual abuse there is, and folks who tying resources to a particular like spiritual conditions. Like there's conditions to whether or not you get these resources. If you want to get food here, then you have to pray with us first. And just that's manipulative, or that could be like a really destructive environment for someone who's on their own spiritual journey and for whom choosing to not pray might be really important. An important assertion of their independence from the spiritual community, from where they're coming, or in yeah, just so many depths and so much context and texture for where people are at in their own spiritual journeys. So I think having like pretty deep awareness that, you know, of what the hope and the goal is. And in the community where I was working, you know, the hope and the goal was connection and community, and people just becoming more fully themselves. So it might be that to become a more full version of yourself, that means you are an atheist now. That might be like the best expression of who you are. And so how, as a chaplain who's not an atheist, how do I make space for that in the community? Or how do I make space for that in pastoral care work? So I think that there's a lot of real discernment, making room for people to be individuals. So often, and I'm sure this is true for the various communities that each of you have worked in, there's a tendency to kind of refer to the homeless community as a monolith, which of course it's as diverse as any other community, and probably more so. So making sure that people can be individuals and express their individuality in group settings, and it doesn't mean that, you know, one person's needs are supreme over others, but just making sure that there's enough space in the room for people to have very different experiences and opinions and beliefs, while holding on to some of those core values of dignity, sacredness of life, presence to one another, peace. You know, when you've got a really diverse community, it's important to kind of keep the peace. So those are all things, I think, just in that starting place of how do you approach street chaplaincy, approaching from a place of real curiosity without projecting, you know, this is what this interaction is going to be, or you know, curiosity, individuality, making sure that people are able to show up as themselves and be seen and received as themselves, and respected. Yeah.
I want to recommend very briefly on that exact point. If you go back a few weeks, we had a really great webinar with Christina Rathbone, who is doing work down in the border. In that interaction with how do you present yourself as a chaplain, and what does that interaction mean with a family that's trying to seek asylum or whatever, is so fraught. And so she really has some nice words there on how to go about that. So I encourage everyone to go back and check that out as well.
Just to say, Tina is my old boss, and she's my mentor. So anything that I just said came right from Tina.
A coincidence? I didn't know that. So a great coincidence. Munir, I want to ask you about sort of what I think in my mind of as the non-critical parts of corrections chaplaincy, because your case has to do with, well, there is this collision of three really important moments for the different faith traditions. How do we make sense of our limited resources and make sure that everybody is, you know, happy to some degree? But what are some of the challenges facing corrections chaplains, or any chaplain, in more sort of everyday, right, when it's not a holy season? What are some of the challenges in sort of attending to everybody when you don't have this otherwise really pressing thing right in front of you got to figure out?
Yeah, I mean, this is not, you know, something that I have a deep knowledge about. I think my colleague Heidi would probably answer better, but just generally, I would say that, you know, making sure that there's enough personnel who actually have the appropriate background to cater to the needs of the different populations. I think there's a preponderance, obviously, of, you know, various Christian denominations represented. Even in terms of volunteers in the Muslim community, while there's a growing awareness that chaplaincy is a thing, and some people have been volunteering outside of, you know, mosque communities and imams, but cultivating really spiritual care practices is something that is very much in its infancy. So I think there's a huge challenge just in terms of being able to bring in appropriate personnel. I think recognition of Muslim religious authorities might also be an issue in some states or some jurisdictions. I recall about a year ago there was an incident where somebody unfortunately was going to be executed, I guess, within the death penalty statutes, and that person had requested an imam to be in the room with them, but that request was denied because an imam was not recognized as a legitimate religious individual to be present, according to the statutes that were still on the books. So I think there's a big catch up that needs to happen in terms of our multi-religious realities of today relative to what might still be institutionally the norm. So I think those are the big structural issues. And I think that, the case study itself gets a little bit into the just sort of interpersonal aspects of, even though the figures in the case study were two Christians, one tended to have more of a attitude of support for the needs of other religious traditions, and the other character was posited as someone who might be more interested in prioritizing the needs of their particular faith community. So I think figuring out how to do that balance so that everyone can be honored is always going to be a challenge for a chaplain in any context. And I think as Libby was talking, I was thinking about, we say this expression, it's about the journey, not the destination. But I would say also that we don't even know what the destination is going to be. In the past, maybe we had this thought that, okay, I'm going to walk aside this person, but I want their destination to be here, which accords with my perspective. But no, I think we have to release ourselves of that. I think in the Islamic tradition, there's this notion that, our job, let's say as preachers or teachers, is to convey the message, whatever that message is, the message of goodness, the message of belief in divine providence. But our job is not to convert people. Allow people to have the relationship that they're going to have with, whether they recognize the divine or not. It's their journey, and we have to, be able to respect that and honor that. So I think in some contexts, like a prison bureau, that can be particularly challenging because of the, sort of tribalistic elements that come into play, right? In that context where anxieties are heightened, tensions can be heightened. And as the case study points out, sometimes people use accommodations provided for religious services or religious gatherings for, nefarious purposes or inappropriate purposes. So those are challenges that have to be navigated.
While there are so many different, I don't want to say versions, but expectations around chaplaincy in all the different settings, the ones that have chaplains whose presence or availability is mandated are really interesting. So corrections, the military, in some ways, these are sort of throw chaplaincy into really stark relief because there are laws surrounding what can and cannot be done. What a prison chaplain can do and shouldn't do. You mentioned the state statute that didn't permit or was interpreted to not permit an imam. All of those sorts of points of collision, I think, are really instructive, even for folks who are not in a setting where chaplaincy has some sort of legal definition or legal framework around it. I think we have maybe time for one more question. I want to ask Jawad, because your case study has such an interesting aspect of interpreting this experience of the patient and taking the patient's experience seriously on their own terms. If you could speak a little bit to if you have found yourself kind of between the patient and the medical team of, no, the patient is experiencing this, which might not look like what the medical team thinks it is or whatever. How have you found yourself there in the middle as an intermediary and done it so successfully?
It happens more often than it happens often, and I take for granted that it happens often. So now that you're asking me, I'm recalling many instances, but because as chaplains, I think someone said we're in the middle. It was Liz, right? Even within the college, we got the patients here, and we got like the providers here on the other side within the healthcare setting, and the chaplains kind of meet them at their story, not able to provide them medication, anything of that nature, but we provide something very unique that only we really do within the healthcare setting, because everyone's got everything else to do, and we're pretty much one of the few professional staff members that can listen the way that we do. And oftentimes there is a triangle that's created. Now the case study is more evocative, purposefully so. So it's an amalgamation of many experiences, and felt very true to how I've experienced things. One instance recently that came up was with one of my, where the stakes weren't as high as this, but there was clearly a triangle where I was an intermediary trying to support this particular patient who was Muslim. It was Ramadan, and she's dealt with, it was upcoming to Ramadan, and partly she was concerned about taking her, there's medication, and then there was the fast, and there was her sense of obligation to have to meet both. And her concern was that, and then there was the second concern, which she was more readily able to talk about, but that she actually believed that she was afflicted by jinn, by spirits, but that wasn't actually getting in the way of her medical care and her psychiatric care, as she was describing. And I was really paying attention to really understand this. And I'm wondering here how much of this needs to be presented to the staff. And I'm here trying to, because of her concern that if I were to say this to the staff, I'm concerned that I would be misinterpreted, I would be misunderstood, and I would therefore have to take more medication and all this other stuff, because I'm in the place of less power and less influence. So, wow. So I'm here holding this very vulnerable space. So I've dealt with many Muslim patients on the medication front of things, but this brought in whole nother dynamic. And I'm very grateful that I was the chaplain, the Muslim chaplain. Quite frankly, there's very few of us in psychiatric settings who have the credentials that I do to be able to be there. And I'm just like, wow, kind of seeing how Munir talked about divine providence. Perhaps this was a message of that coming through here. And then speaking to her provider about that, and sitting there for about half an hour and educating her, and her telling me, I get it. And fortunately, it was a value of our setting to respond appropriately to folks' culture and religious, backgrounds. And, it's not uncommon within the psychiatric field, but fortunately I was with the folks I was with. So that was a place where I definitely was in the middle, and I was trying to hold a lot of her anxious space and a lot of the staff's curiosity as an intermediary, and using my authority for the benefit of the patient.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you all. I see we're coming up on the top of the hour here. It always goes really quickly. So thank you all for being with us. I do want to encourage everyone, go check out the case studies. They don't take terribly long to get through. I think they're all intended to be about 30 minutes. They're very easily accessible. It's free, of course, so you can do all of that. They're really thought-provoking. They're really thought-provoking, and I think that everyone will benefit from them enormously just by taking a look. So thank you very much. I'll remind everyone this is recorded, so if you came in late, no problem. You will get a link to this recording in the next probably a week or so, along with a link to a feedback survey. Just let us know what you thought. It takes maybe 2 minutes. I would really appreciate that. Thank you all very much. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.